Viewers of the channel and followers of the channel's Facebook page may be aware that recently I had the opportunity to visit South Africa. Now, I most obviously have returned, but while I was there, I was able to participate in many cultural and military history activities at the invitation of one of the UK's premier living history organisations, the Diehard Company of the Victorian Military Society. Although this was not necessarily a shooting holiday, well, not with live ammunition anyway, it nevertheless proved to be a once-in-a-lifetime trip. I thought that our exploits in South Africa might make for the subject of a somewhat interesting video. I hope, once you've finished watching this, that you'll agree. Okay, I think they're on the couch now. They're nice and comfy. Get out the projector and roll the vacation slides. In 2016, during the lead up to a vacation in the UK, a friend of mine put me in touch with a friend of his, with the thought that there might be some mutual interest. This would prove to blossom, for me, into a most rewarding transatlantic association with the Diehards. They are the UK's premier Victorian military living history organisation. They were formed in 1993 by Graham and Tim, both of whom are still active in their own respective ways. Tim handles day-to-day operations, while Graham publishes their newsletter. They specialize in presenting representations across multiple eras. Home service of the 1880s, complete with the blue home service helmets and 82 pattern valise equipment. The Crimean War, the Second Boer War, and the Anglo-Zulu War. When Tim and Graham were deciding on how to present the mid-Victorian army, they chose what was known as a county regiment. Not the Guards, or the Rifles, or a Highland regiment, but a regiment of the type that made up the vast majority of the army at the time. They settled on the Middlesex Regiment as a perfect example of the English county regiment. The company's name was derived from the nickname of the Middlesex Regiment and one of their antecedent regiments, the 57th Foot. At the Battle of Albuera in 1811, the 57th Foot, brigaded with the 48th and the 29th, stood with the rest of the British and Spanish forces in the way of Marshal Soult, who was on his way to relieve the British siege of Badajoz. The 57th stood in their line and fought to the bitter end. By the time it was said and done, they had stopped the French, but at a horrible cost, being reduced from 600 officers and men to 160. At the climax of the horror, their colonel, seeking to steady the ranks in the midst of the raging exchange of musketry, was heard to call out,
"Die hard, 57th! Die hard!"
Thereafter, the regiment was known by the name derived from their colonel's command that day. So began what today is recognized as a leader in their field, Victorian military living history and reenactment. In 2016, after talking to Graham and Tim, arrangements were made for me to meet up with the company at a military history fair in southern England, known as Military Odyssey. What followed was a most enjoyable bank holiday weekend, meeting the members of the company and participating fully in the presentations of tactics and maneuver at various times during the weekend. This fantastic experience would sow the seeds for another most epic rendezvous with the company on the other side of the world. This trip was not a one-off chance opportunity for the Diehards. 2019 marked the 140th anniversary of the Anglo-Zulu War, and the group was invited by the King of the Zulus himself, King Goodwill, through his cultural ministry, to come to South Africa and assist in the various commemorative and cultural activities that were planned for January. Now, the Diehards had been to South Africa before, twice in fact, in 1999 and 2009, and relationships had been established and built upon. It wasn't an easy run-up, as Tim will attest, but in the end flights were booked and arrangements made. For this trip, the Diehards would not be alone. Building on a long-time association with another group, the Queen's Royal West Surrey Regiment Reenactment Society, run by James, the Diehards and the Queens combined to form a new group, A Company, 24th Foot, for the trip and other associated activities. Now, this group's name was a play on words, as it did not refer to a company, but rather a company, as in any company. A subtle play on words eminently suitable for the wide-ranging upcoming activities. Our itinerary in the end was very busy, and here I shall outline some of the highlights. So that's a quick introduction to the Diehards, the Queens, and how I came to know them. As we carry on in part 1, we'll examine the itinerary of the trip, including the many activities and commemorations we participated in. As well, we'll examine the clothing, kit, and weapons carried by the British infantry in Zululand in 1879. Indeed, precisely the article that we were representing during our trip. The trip began with some requisite administration. We stopped by Higher Arms of Johannesburg, who were to supply the martinis and bayonets for our time in South Africa. We would be joined at various times throughout the trip by Bruce, the armourer. Then we were off to Dundee, where we were billeted at the Royal Hotel Country Inn. The inn was to be our base for the remainder of the trip. It was quite possibly the most appropriate location for the company to stay. The walls were decorated with all sorts of Zulu and Boer War memorabilia and artwork. The food was good, and the rooms comfortable. If only the men from 140 years ago could have been so well looked after. We paraded on our first day for a quick photo opportunity. Our visit had caught the attention of the local paper, which placed us squarely on the front page. We made the first of 3 visits to the Isandlwana area, where we marked the occasion at the visitor center with a short service. Later, we found ourselves at Ulundi, the ancient Zulu capital. There, we met for the first time the Zulu Amabutho. After meeting up with them, we attended a small ceremony where dignitaries talked, and appreciation for our presence there was made clear. After the parade, we were able to take in the local museum, where we were given a short lecture on the history of the Zulu people and shown artifacts from their cultural and geographical history. The site for all of this was at the former site of the kraal of King Ketshawile. That evening was taken up by a parade through the streets of Ulundi, colours flying and bayonets fixed, as it were, sharing the route with a police honour guard and, of course, the Amabutho. At its conclusion, at a local hotel, we attended a banquet where we were first to come face to face with the king himself. Speeches and ceremonies abounded. The next day marked the actual anniversary of the Battle of Isandlwana. As you might expect, the formal activities were to take place on this hallowed ground. The location for them was to be a series of huge tents, complete with a main central marquee. These were set up on the periphery of the battlefield, in fact close to where A Company was to deploy on the day of battle. There were the usual ceremonial welcomes, and the king made the central speech. Later, a memorial was christened by clergy, and wreaths laid by the king and others. Tim was asked at the 11th hour to place a wreath and say a few words. Needless to say, this duty was done to great credit. Next was a trip to Rorke's Drift, where we had time to soak in the atmosphere and magnitude of that little battlefield. Rorke's Drift is a much more digestible site than the sprawling grounds at Isandlwana. Small does not adequately describe it. In fact, one can walk from one side of the grounds to the other in about 30 seconds. What it lacks in size is more than made up for by its intimacy. With so many survivors, stories and anecdotes abound, and importantly, can be placed exactly or very close to the place they actually occurred on the grounds. To imagine thousands of men swarming to the attack, and the 100-odd defenders standing behind the barricades, all of which had been laid out by stones inlet into the ground, put the desperation and bravery of both sides in proper context. A number of lectures were delivered to the company on various aspects of the battle, from descriptions of the fighting at various locations, to the spots where particular features or fortifications were placed, and the company were put through some tactical evolutions and discussions. This also included a short experiment to judge how fast the ground between the hospital and the storehouse could be covered, as may have happened during the evacuation of the burning hospital during the battle. We did have some downtime for our own exploration and discussion, not to mention tea and some rest. We also took some time for our own commemorative photographs to mark the occasion. Throughout the trip, we crossed paths with one of the preeminent Zulu War historians, Ian Knight, who was leading a tour group of his own for the anniversary. The company put on numerous displays and demonstrations of tactics and formations periodically throughout the trip. This was much enjoyed by the tour groups. The visit was rounded out with a short service. Here, a short commemoration was given by Ian, with a wreath laid by himself and Thelma, one of the ladies of the company. The observance was concluded with a short benediction given by a very kind minister who happened to have been on the grounds at that time. His solemn additions lent to the magnitude of the occasion. We left Rorke, marching off the grounds at twilight. We did make time to visit a battlefield from a later war, Speen from the Second Boer War. This solemn and moving location was not lost on the company, as although we were in South Africa primarily to commemorate the Zulu War, the Second Boer War was not far from the interests of many of the members. The site of a heartbreaking defeat of the British at the hands of the Boers. The singular feature is of course a long line of stones delineated with a white painted border. This feature marks the shelter trench as dug by the troops who had arrived at what they thought was the summit. Sadly, for so many, it would also become their final resting place. A great number were from Lancashire, and this battle would forever be in the collective memory of the people of that county and of the city of Liverpool. As at Rorke's Drift, the company were given a number of small impromptu lectures, and a wreath was placed on the memorial to the various battalions and units which fought on top of the feature, the Middlesex Regiment being among them. We finished the visit with some free time to explore the hill and examine the nuances of the ground. We were also able to determine the locations of prominent Boer positions that gave the men on the summit such grief. Later that day, we visited Ladysmith and the city's museum, which chronicled the siege of the town, the relief of which the Battle of Speen had been fought in an attempt to raise. The next day, we visited the battlefield of Talana outside of Dundee. There, Pat, a friend of the Diehards, who runs the museum there, kindly provided the grounds for our use to practice and rehearse. We made yet another visit to Isandlwana, this time to rehearse for the battle reenactment. As well as meeting our friends from the Amabutho yet again, we were also introduced to another group from South Africa, known as the Dundee Diehards. They would be joining the company in the following days for the battle reenactment. The battle reenactment was done the following day. and was attended by King Goodwill and thousands of locals.
Surrounding on all sides, and in come the chest. But the British soldiers stand back to back and fight as they are trained to do rather than retreat.
The company presented the king with a set of replica colours of the 24th foot. Most interestingly, the king reciprocated with a most humbling gift. The king personally presented Tim and James with what is known as an amabatha. The honour was also bestowed upon the rest of the company. Unbeknownst to us at the time, but made clear to us shortly thereafter, the amabatha is indeed the symbol of a great honour bestowed upon the recipient. Apparently, we were told that the only other Westerner to have ever been presented one was Prince Charles. Perhaps at that moment, we truly realized that our presence at these functions and ceremonies was exceptionally meaningful to the Zulu nation, placing things in perspective and with mutual and honest appreciation and reverence. There was to be time for some photographic moments, and the company performed some tactical evolutions. It's not every day that you can practice drill book evolutions with a formed body of people who are aware and skilled of Victorian drill in the shadow of Isandlwana, after all. Ian Knight's tour group made a particularly appreciative audience. In the days following the battle reenactment, we were taken on a tour of the Isandlwana battlefield organized by Pat from the Talana Battlefield Park and Museum. Of particular note, there was the view from the ridge overlooking the battlefield from which the Zulu command observed and conducted the battle. We made a stop at Rorke's Drift, the actual drift across the Buffalo River. It was here that the pontoon bridge, which John Chart had been sent to repair and maintain, was constructed. We took in the famous donga from where Durnford and his men made their stand before retiring to the camp, and we ended up back at the saddle amongst the memorials and white-painted cairns, marking the graves of those who fell in the last frenzied fight before being finally overwhelmed. We paid our respects at the various memorials and cenotaphs. This included the one to Durnford's men. As well, a wreath was laid at the 24th cenotaph by Tim and Pat, colours flying and the company at the present. After some time to explore and mark the occasion, we paid our respects to the Zulu people whose warriors had fought bravely and most successfully on that day. To finish the day, it was a short hop back to Rorke's Drift, where a similar tribute was paid to the men of the Undi Corps of the Zulu army who had tried to take the mission station during the battle. The Zulu memorial to them is of particular poignancy. As the trip wound down, there became some time available for some outright tourism. The company broke into two groups, with one group going on a game drive and the other, smaller group, deciding to make arrangements to revisit the battlefield of Isandlwana and the surrounding area. A friend of one of the company, Eric, an amateur historian of particular ability, very kindly drove the seven of us in his tiny Datsun pickup back to the battlefield. We hiked the Fugitives Trail to the site of the stand of Captain Anstey and what remained of his 60 or so men who had broken out of the Zulu encirclement at the mountain and attempted to reach safety. Once we returned to the saddle, we embarked on a most candid examination of the ground. This had been impossible before, due to duty and other commitments. Eric told us stories and exploits of exploration of the area many years ago. Of particular note was our ability to finally move down the slope away from the camp area to the so-called Rocky Ridge, which extended east towards the conical hill known as Amatuchain. Here was where the main firing line was established, and a most careful study of the ground was undertaken. This was aided greatly by the book How Can Man Die Better by Colonel Mike Snook. We took a copy along and were able to read and quote from its pages, chronicling the battle while we navigated the features and locations mentioned in the text. Colonel Snook does a fantastic job describing the ground and its effect, and we completed the picture by actually standing on it and seeing it for ourselves. This was of particular meaning and importance to me. The field trip finished at the end of the Fugitives Trail, at Fugitives Drift, the point at which the survivors from Isandlwana crossed the Buffalo River, and paid their respects at the graves of Melville and Coghill. These were the two officers who had attempted to save the colors of the 24th. They are buried not far from the river, where they had crossed, seeking safety. One final event completed the trip. The company played host to the local mayor and the king's cultural minister at a mess dinner at the hotel. Speeches were given and presentations made as the necessary platitudes were exchanged. With songs and stories passing into the night, A Company, 24th Foot, saw its duty done. All that remained was the long journey home. For the benefit of those viewers who may not be particularly versed in the clothes, equipment, and weapons of the Zulu War, perhaps a brief commentary to place what you have just seen used by the company in South Africa into greater context. The basic items of clothing were as follows. The universal upper body undergarment was known as the greyback shirt. It was made of flannel and had a small stand-up collar. For fatigue work, the sleeves were rolled up, and the collar was undone and rolled to the inside to provide for greater comfort. The trousers were made of blue wool, and running down the outside was a 1/4 inch scarlet welt. The boots were simple black leather affairs which were laced to the ankle, on top of which were worn a set of black leather gaiters which were laced up the side. These served two functions. First, to keep debris out of the boot, and second, to gather the cuff of the trousers, raising it, keeping it out of the mud, as well as protecting it from any damage that may result from walking through bush and other undergrowth. The upper body garment was the late 19th century version of the combat jacket, known as the frock. This was a simpler version of the more ornate tunic. Made of coarser and harder wearing serge, the frock lacked the embellishment of its full dress cousin. Commonly found with 5 buttons versus 7 on the tunic, it also lacked the white piping down the front. In the 1870s, it often had cuff embellishments that mimicked those found on the 1871 pattern tunic. In the case of the 24th Foot, green facings and a trefoil knot. Unlike the tunic, it was unlined and was very much the working garment of the mid-Victorian army. On the head was worn one of 2 types of headdress. The universal forage cap of the era was this, the Glengarry. In blue for most regiments, it was used in camp, barracks, and while off duty. Perhaps the more iconic form of headdress of the campaign was this, the Foreign Service helmet. Introduced in the 1860s, its design by the 1870s had settled upon a somewhat standard form. It was made of cork and covered in light drill. Its official color was white. But for field and campaign use, the outer fabric was stained with tea. Its lightweight and front and back peaks gave reasonable protection from the sun. And it was secured with a leather chin strap. Thus clothed, the infantrymen of the Zulu War marched and fought. As mentioned, there were regimental differences, and importantly, the artillery, light cavalry, and the services wore their own version of the frock in blue. The personal equipment of the infantry took the form of the 1871 valise equipment. The full set, including the valise, was known as marching order and consisted of the following components: the valise, the mess tin in its cover, the greatcoat, or blanket as the case may be, the Glengarry tucked under the straps holding the greatcoat, a set of braces supporting the weight, a waist belt 2 ammunition pouches, one left, one right, intending to hold 20 rounds. An expense pouch, which could hold up to 30, although typically somewhat less than that was carried because 30 rounds in that pouch made it very ungainly. Accompanying this was also the haversack for rations and other personal items, the Italian pattern water bottle, and of course, this, 22 inches of cold steel, the 1876 pattern Martini Henry bayonet. Now, the complete set of valise equipment, as I'm wearing here, was not carried in the field during the Zulu War. Instead, the valise was removed and transported for the men in unit transport, thereby lightening their load. What was used more regularly could be termed light marching order, the order of dress I'm wearing here, without the valise. When the unit encamped for the night, the valises were brought forward, allowing the men access to their contents that were not necessarily required for the march, but certainly appreciated while in camp. Light marching order would afford the man everything he would require for the day. His ammunition, water, his dry food in the form of biscuit held in the haversack, and his meat ration, cooked the night before, held in the mess tin. This left him unencumbered by things such as spare clothing and cleaning materials, carried in the valise. Yet another order of dress, in fact the one seen during our trip to South Africa, was lighter still, termed belt order. In this order of dress, the greatcoat, mess tin, and braces were all left in a static location, perhaps at camp, in barracks, or some other location, leaving just the belt, ammunition, haversack, and water bottle. Now the thing about this order of dress is that it wasn't necessarily intended to be used while separated from the rest of your kit. Ammunition would undoubtedly be close at hand, as well as food and water. As you can see here, and my equipment is loaded with 70 rounds at this point, is that with the 20 rounds in each of the 2 pouches and the lack of support afforded by the braces, the belt sags considerably at the front, and it is not, when fully loaded, a particularly comfortable way of wearing your kit. You'll notice here that my expense pouch is hung at the rear of the belt. There is some photographic evidence to suggest that this was perhaps one way of doing it. From this position, the expense pouch could be brought forward to the front of the belt, thereby allowing easy access to the ammunition therein. Now, the weight of up to 30 rounds in the expense pouch, joining the already considerable amount of 40 rounds in the ammunition pouches, would make for an incredibly ill-balanced and uncomfortable load. After all, there were braces specifically designed for the purpose of supporting this weight. Now, in certain circumstances, such as those found at Rorke's Drift, and to a certain extent at the camp at Isandlwana, this order of dress may have been used. Another consideration, especially as regards our trip to South Africa, was one of logistics. Because A Company 24th Foot was a composite group formed from the Diehards and the Queens, not all the members possessed all the articles of kit. By adopting this order of dress, we were all able to dress the same while still maintaining a degree of historical accuracy. Now a case could be made for the use of light marching order at Isandlwana versus Rorke's Drift. At Rorke's Drift, the men were fighting from behind barricades in a very small area, with ammunition exceptionally close at hand. At Isandlwana, the distances involved for supply were quite considerable, and the majority of the action took place in front of the camp. The escalation of the battle was somewhat gradual, with the men standing to earlier in the day a number of times before being committed forward into the firing line. Because of this, there's a possibility that they were paraded in light marching order, ready for action out in front of the camp. We'll never know, because all those men who were wearing that equipment that day were killed in action.
Now, the primary reason for carrying any equipment at all was to carry ammunition. The 71 valise equipment had provision for up to 70 rounds, held in a combination of packets and loose rounds. The front two ammunition pouches were both intended to carry 20 rounds, in paper packets such as this. These packets were open, and the rounds inside them placed into the expense pouch for easy use. Now, the pouch will hold 30 rounds, but I can attest that having such a number inside this pouch with its simple suspension system makes it a very ungainly item, and chances are more like 20, with a small reserve of 10 rounds kept in the haversack may have been a better and more balanced option. The rifle used by the British Army in the Anglo-Zulu War was the venerable Martini Henry. Adopted in 1871, but not entering service until the early to mid-1870s, it was still a relatively new weapon at the time of the Anglo-Zulu War. Despite this, it had proven itself a highly effective weapon in the hands of the professional British infantry, while it campaigned in South Africa earlier in the decade. A single-shot breech loader, its action was smooth and efficient, and the ammunition it used fired a 480-grain projectile at 1,300 feet per second, making it highly lethal. British infantry of the era were trained to use their Martini Henrys out to 800 yards, both individually as well as collectively, by either firing independently or in volleys. This fire could be delivered in either the close order two-rank formation as used for generations before, or in the relatively newly universally adopted extended order. Of course, for close-in work, there was the 1876 pattern bayonet.
To say that our trip to South Africa was meaningful would be a severe understatement. It wasn't so much a holiday, but rather an experience which the members of the company will not soon forget. Many hours were spent in transit from location to location, and we spent the same, standing on parade, acting in the absence of any formal military presence, as the de facto representatives of the UK for many parades, ceremonies, functions, and presentations that were undertaken in the presence of King Goodwill. I think I can speak for all when I say that only after our return from South Africa did the magnitude of what we participated in come to light. It was a major cultural event for the Zulu people, and we were fortunate enough to play a most major role in it. Truly a once-in-a-lifetime trip. Special thanks needs to be given to certain individuals. Firstly, my heartfelt gratitude needs to be extended to Tim for including me in his lists and planning, which ultimately resulted in me being able to participate in the endeavor. Next, to all the members of the company for their welcoming friendship and professional outlook. It was a pleasure working with you all. My roommates of Room 1, Pete, Toby, and Minty. I could not have asked for better. Finally, particular gratitude goes to Georgina and Joe for their kind permission to use some of their photos in this presentation. They, along with Thelma, added class to what otherwise would have been a brutish and unshaven mob of scarlet-clad gentlemen.
I hope you've enjoyed this look at our expedition and commemoration in South Africa. In the next part, we'll examine some of the battles and battlefields that we were able to visit while we were there. I hope this has whet your appetite for what's to come.
Although only a couple of rounds were fired here by way of demonstration, the brass and molds for the Martini Henry can be had from Martin at X-Ring Services. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.